All right, well, hey everyone, welcome back. So last week we basically covered the basics of DDEV. Um, you know, getting a brand new Drupal site up and running in DDEV. We covered that. Some of the basic commands. I forget who it was, but someone had a question about using WordPress in DDEV, and we kind of went through that little demo as well. And so for today, what I had planned was uh, the first thing I thought we'd do just to kind of get back into things is clone an existing site and get it up and running in DDEV. And this is a pretty common task if you're new on a project and you're given a git clone URL and a database dump. How do you get that up and running on your local? So this will kind of mirror that with, and I've got a public repo out on GitHub called DDEV Demo that you can follow along with or use at your own convenience. So I figured we'd do that. I think it sounds like everybody wants to see the Git Pod demo. So I'll definitely leave time like the last 15, 20 minutes for Git Pod demo, which is basically using DDEV and Git Pod to have a completely remote development environment, including VS Code. So really the only thing you need installed on your machine would be a browser, which means you could actually do full Drupal development on a Chromebook or an iPad or something like that once you get it, set up. So that's a pretty cool demo. It's something I've started playing with. In between, we can talk about command hooks. I've got a quick little demo for that, just kind of a way to quickly extend in the example I have the web container by adding some more tools to the web container automatically. And then we can, depending on time, there's some other DDEV commands which we can talk about. But I figure the two big things will be this DDEV demo, and then the Git Pod demo. So that sound good? Any other requests before I dive in? No? All right, great. All right, so so I basically have a code base up on GitHub, and I have DDEV installed. So if you do DDEV version, I think I have the latest, unless the new ones come out in the past few days. But the plan is I'm going to clone this site down to my local and get it up and running, and pretty much that's it. So I'm going to come over here to GitHub, and I'm going to use HTTPS since this is what everyone else would have. Unless you fork, then you could use SSH. But I'm not planning on doing any pushes right now, so I'll just I'm going to do SSH just in case. So I'm going to do SSH, so git clone, and git clone will basically create a new directory called DDEV demo in my current sites directory, and basically clone this there. This is a full Drupal, I think it's Drupal 9 code, no, Drupal 8.9 code base. Look at that. Actually, no, let me see. Is it? I think it's Drupal 8 still. The only funky thing about this, it does have some modules. It has a theme, but I actually put the database backup in the repo as well, and actually backup of the files directory. And I did that just because it's easier doing a demo rather than having to go somewhere else and download the database dump. But under most circumstances, you wouldn't have a database backup or a files backup in the repo. You'd have to go somewhere else and download that database backup. So once we get it done, let's cd into the DDEV demo directory, and take a look around. We already have dependencies, so dependencies have been committed to this repo. As always, I have the chat right in front of me, so if anybody has a question, you can either interrupt me or put something up in the chat. So this is basically, it's a Drupal 8 site ready to go. So the first thing we want to do is we want to tell DDEV about it. Now, technically, I already have a DDEV configuration in here, but let's say you didn't. To tell DDEV about it, it's the same thing we saw last week. It's this DDEV config command. And it's basically saying, hey, DDEV, configure some containers for this project. And it'll ask us some questions. First, it'll ask us for the project name, and it'll guess that we want it to be the same as the directory name, which was a pretty good guess. It'll sniff around and see if we might have a web root, in which case it found the web directory, which is indeed our web root. So that's the right answer as well. And then it also sniffs around the code base to figure out what kind of project type we want. And it correctly guessed that this was a Drupal 8 project, as opposed to one of these types that DDEV also supports. So it asks us 3 questions, but it already knows all 3 answers. So that DDEV config basically generates a fresh DDEV config in this directory. Can DDEV be installed on virtual machine? Yeah, sure. Yep. And actually Gitpod, Gitpod, when we see the Gitpod demo, that's actually running Docker inside of another Docker. So that's kind of pretty cool. But yeah, there's no reason why it can't be run on a VM. Okay, so once we have that, we should just be able to do a DDEV start and see something. We're not going to see everything yet because we haven't done anything. We haven't done anything with the database or the files directory yet. But this will spin up our containers. And normally you'll see 3 containers. You'll see the database container, the web container, then also a DBA or database administrator container. Except on my system, I have the DBA container always disabled because I just don't use it. So it's one less container that needs to be spun up. So at this point, the containers are running and we can grab this URL and come over and theoretically, there we go, a little pokey there. Come on. Load this site, and basically we should see the install page, right? Because we haven't told Drupal about the database yet. Drupal thinks this is a brand new site because we haven't imported the database, and sure enough, there is our, our Drupal page. So a few things I always like to do on my local, and we talked about this last week or 2 weeks ago, but I always want to make sure we have the local settings file. So if we do an ls-al on web, sites, default, take a look. Notice there is no settings.local. DDEV created this for us. Settings.pantheon is part of the repo. But there's no settings.local. So what we can do is we can do this a couple different ways. There's actually drush command, a drush generate command. Anybody ever use that one? So you can do drush generate settings local, and really all that does, that basically just does a CP of web, sites, example, settings.local, and copies that to web, sites, default, settings.local.php. So the drush generate settings local basically just does this file copy. See, there's questions. Yes, Mike, you can absolutely automate DDEV to do things. I'll actually, I'll show you a quick example of that as well. How did you disable the DBA? John's asking as well. So here, I'll take a quick, well, here, let me finish the settings local, then I'll show you, John. And yell at me if I forget in the next 5 minutes, because my memory is that of a small bird. Let's just take a quick look at the settings.php, because we want to make sure that we can conditionally include settings.local. Just by creating it, it doesn't get used unless it's included in settings.php. So we go into the bottom of our settings.php, and in this repo, I already have uncommented. So basically, you just want to make sure that you have this conditional include. If you have a fresh site or a fresh repo, a lot of times these 3 lines, these 3 lines will be commented out and you have to uncomment them out. But as long as you see this, then your settings.local is going to be conditionally included. All right, so John, to answer your question, I believe there is a DDEV config -- help. I think there's a config global. Could be wrong. Yeah. Yep. So there's a global. And if you do global, then you can, so when you do a DDEV config global and then pass something to it, which in this case, you're going to pass to it. Let's see if I can find it, if it's even here. TBA, is it this one? No, I don't know if it's that one. TBA. Well, here, I know how to find it. Basically, what you have to do is you have to look in your home directories, .ddev directory, and then there's a global config. So if we cat .ddev global config, you'll see the key that in mine. Yeah, there we go. Omit containers. That's the line you want. Oh, thank you, Mike. Mike O'Hara beat me to it. Right. So I believe the command would be something like, and someone can correct me if someone wants to try it. DDEV config global -- omit containers equals DBA. Let's try it. Yeah, it looks like that's right. So yeah, there you go, John. I'll put that in the chat. And someone can yell at me if it doesn't work for some reason. All right, so back to the task at hand. So settings.local is all set up, but that doesn't solve this problem. What solves this problem is importing a database. So again, if you take a look, we clone down that database backup. And there's our database backup right there. So luckily, DDEV has a handy import, that's the Dutch spelling, import DB command, and you just pass a string, a source, I'm sorry. DB backup, DDEV, there you go. So this source, it can either be GZ or uncompressed. I think it also takes zip, not 100% sure. So DDEV import DB, you take that. So Pana, I have never tried to install it on a VM, so I don't know if I'll be able to help you. Front end brew. Yeah, I don't know if I'd be able to help you. Honestly, I think the best place to ask that is in the #DDEV channel on the Drupal Slack workspace. The folks in there are really responsive, and I actually would suggest you try there because I think I would end up doing the same thing you're probably doing. That's Googling, or ask the folks in the #DDEV channel. So, okay. Yeah. So so it looks like Mike and Matt are both anti-equal sign. They're taking offense to me constantly using the equal sign. So you can edit that out of the video, the equal sign, if you want. So here's why I do stuff like that. Because I teach this a lot. I'm teasing, by the way. I teach a lot, so I tend to do things very explicitly. I try not to take shortcuts, and I try to, when I type out commands, I try to type them out in a way that makes the most sense rather than is the most time efficient. So I think, and this is just kind of the way I think seeing that source equals this basically links the two of them, because folks who are new to the command line or new-ish might see a command like this and not know automatically that these two things are connected, right? So that's why I do stuff like that. I do stuff like that all the time. So, but yeah, Mike and Matt are absolutely right. There's, you can omit the equal sign in both those cases. But anyway, we imported the database. Yay! So reload, and we'll get a, hey, Drupal's already installed. View your existing site. All right, I'll do that. And so we're almost home after this. You'll see we have some images because this is silly enough. This is linked to my dev site. this image, absolute image length. But all these images down here of all these desserts, there's no images there because I have not done anything with the files directory yet. So we do have a files backup, similar to the way we had a database backup. Now, really, all you need to do is unzip this and stick it in website. Oh, not web. What am I doing? Websites default, right? You just have to put it in here in this files directory. So it's not that difficult of a task to unzip and move files, right? You can do that via the command line or, in the Finder, Windows Explorer, or whatever. But DDEV does give us an import files command that does exactly that. And it's not rocket science what this does. It literally just uncompresses it and puts it in the right place. And once we do that, just for good measure, I'm going to rebuild the caches. And now if we reload, we should be good to go. And there we go. So now we got all these lovely desserts from around the world. And we're ready to develop, right? So, one of the pain points that, I've noticed in my 14, 15, I think 15 years of Drupal, and even forget about this Drupal web development, is coming onto a new project and having to get the site up and running locally. It can be a real pain, especially if your project has things like Solar or Redis or, some, Gulp or, based front end tool chain. Just getting all those tools in place, everything installed, make sure you're using the right version of this and the right version of that, especially PHP. Your system might be set up for a different version of PHP, and you have to get all that organized. With a tool like DDEV, and I'm demoing DDEV, but same goes for Lando, same goes for Doxel and other Docker-based solutions. Really, only one developer has to set up this DDEV configuration, and that could include additional containers, specific versions of PHP, specific versions of MySQL, blah, 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 blah. But once that config is set up, once you clone, if you just do a DDEV start, if this is already set up, you're going to have the exact same environment as everybody else. So even with me yapping and explaining as I've done this, it took me, 17 minutes to do this. So really, if you have the git clone address, access to the database dump, access to the files directory, and you're not yapping, and you have DDEV installed, you can get a site up and running on your machine in 5-10 minutes. So in my opinion, that is a huge, huge win for Docker-based local development environments. All right, so since someone asked, so who asked up above about the, can you hook into DDEV start to do other actions? Mike O'Hara. So yeah, let's do that. So I'm gonna start out with the demo that I planned, and we'll kind of extend it, Mike, for yours, but so I was, and I just created this the other day because I had a question from one of my students about WebP, the image format WebP, which out of the box, Drupal does not support. Actually, it's both a server solution, a server issue, as well as a Drupal issue. So I said, all right, well, let's go through the process of making it so that DDEV can support WebP. And in order for that to happen, well, we need to install basically a WebP extension to the server, using apt-get, kind of the Linux package manager stuff. So we have this project up and running. We could do a DDEV SSH, right? And we can SSH right into the web container. And, we can come in here and we can start doing apt-get commands. Like I'll do an apt-get update right there. And this will work, right? But, we're making changes to the web container, right? We're not making changes, a change to the web container that we're going to commit to our repo. We're actually making kind of an underlying change to the web container. So the minute I do a DDEV stop, poof, that change is gone. We lose that change, right? So it's kind of like me creating a text file, in that web container, not committing it, because doing a DDEV stop actually removes the container. It doesn't remove, we don't lose our code base, because our code base is actually mirrored to Mac OS in my case, or Windows, via the file system, or it's committed to the repo. So it's non-destructive, so that the next time we do DDEV start, it's going to remount to the file system, to the shared directory, which is our project. But we're not going to have those apt-get updates anymore. So what we want to do is, how can we modify the DDEV configuration so that we can make changes to the environment, to that web container that stick, and maybe not stick, but that are repeatable. And we do that with hooks, with DDEV hooks. So, this is all documented. Look at this. It's going to be the second time I mentioned my book. It's in the book as well. There's a whole chapter or section on hooks. But if you do DDEV.read the docs, and let's see if I can find it quickly. Extending and customizing environments, maybe. Hooks. Let me just go up here and do command hooks. So if if you're comfortable with Drupal development, then the idea of a hook makes sense, right? So the idea of a hook in Drupal is, like as an example, hook user login. That basically, if you implement that hook, whenever a user logs in, your module will have a chance to get involved in the process of somebody logging in. That's the whole idea of a hook. And there's dozens, if not hundreds, of hooks in Drupal, where as a developer, you can write a custom module to get involved in a process. DDEV does the same thing. There's a pre-start hook, a post-start, right? So pre-start gets called right before, like when you run DDEV start, before DDEV does any of its start stuff, you can do something. Post-start is after DDEV does its start stuff. So there's pre and post start, there's pre and post import DB, there's pre and post import files, pre and post composer commands, a bunch of others as well. Not for every single DDEV command, but for a lot of them. So post start is especially handy, especially for something like this, right? And that's kind of the place where we can do stuff to the environment, or as Mike was asking, perform stuff in the environment in an automated fashion. So let's do that. It's actually really easy to do once you see it. So I'm going to just pico my .ddev config file, because that's where all this stuff lives. And I'm going to come down here, and I've got this ready to copy and paste, so you don't have to watch me type. But there's a hooks. You can add a hook section. And then it's all YAML, so make sure you've got 2 spaces, and I didn't. Well, I don't know I think it just has to be indented. I don't know if it has to be 2, but I'm anal retentive when it comes to this stuff, so I always use 2. So here's your list of hooks. I'm going to say, I'm going to have a post-start hook. The exec is basically the DDEV exec command. And here, I'm going to exit out of this. DDEV exec - help. That is the same as DDEV dot. So DDEV exec is basically saying, hey, DDEV, run the following command in the web container by default, right? So if I do DDEV dot chmod, whatever, right? Something, I'm not running this chmod in Mac OS. DDEV is passing this command into the container, into the web container by default. So the exec command basically is just telling DDEV, run this command in the web container by default. So it's saying, hey, DDEV, first thing I want you to do is execute, and again, in the web container by default, sudo apt-get update. When that's done, execute sudo apt-get install, answer yes, the webp package. So, and really, that's it. DDEV restart, and we'll see it happen. And you can go crazy from here with just post. I use post start all the time, but with just post start, once start is done, we'll see it here. There it is. Here's apt-get, the update, and here comes the install webp. It's getting all the stuff. Boom, and we're done. So from there, I mean, now the sky's the limit. Right? You can start running drush commands. How about a composer install? Maybe you should have run the drush command before that. How about a import all the configs? So now I'd probably put this. Yeah, so now I'm bothered by this being here. So let's. There we go. That's better. So I don't have any config to import, and my dependencies are already there, but you get the idea. All right, so it becomes really easy to start doing stuff there. So I think I probably answered your question there, Mike. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and just delete this stuff as well. All right, where are we on time? 36 after. I want to show you snapshots. I actually like snapshots. I don't use them as much as I should, mainly because my machine, this MacBook Pro, when I bought it, I really should have bought the next size up in hard drive. So I'm always fighting hard drive space. And database snapshots actually take up a bit of room because they're not database dumps that are automatically compressed. So let's talk about what a snapshot is, and I'll create some here and just immediately delete them. DDEV snapshot help. It's just a really quick way of creating a database snapshot of the project. And actually, I think it does do the whole thing. Yeah, just a database snapshot. So we can do DDEV snapshot -- name equals pre-migrate, right? So before you start something that might go sideways, create a snapshot. All right, and it'll take a second, but it's basically making a mirror of your database, and you can look at that in .ddev db. So you got a new directory called pre-migrate. And like I said, it's not a database dump. It is just a full clone of all your database files right there. So I don't know what the ls-alh .ddev. And this is a pretty small database, but we'll do a quick size comparison. So this is oh no, that's just the size of the directory. That's not helping me. Yeah, well, that's the big file right there. So let's do this. So 76 megs. So let's say this is 77 megs, roughly. That. If I do DDEV export db test.d.sql.gz, that's not even 1 meg. So, these database snapshots are obviously much, much bigger than. Thank you, Matt. DU-S. I always forget. I just had this conversation with one of my students about how I am the most average command line user ever. I know like the basic commands, and I'm really good with the basic commands, but as soon as I get out of my comfort zone, I run to Google. I can't grep anything without Google.
We all do that.
Well, I don't know. Matt came up with Matt, did you Google du-s? So.
No, you know how I remember it, and it's rude, but like if you summarize du summarize and then the human readable h, then it's a rude word. So that's easy.
There you go. Yeah. Okay, I see. Hey, you gotta do what you gotta do to. Oh yeah. So let me do that. Yeah. So 155 megs. It's double what I thought. I must have missed some files when I was looking. Is there another? How does that get to? I don't see the math there. How did that get to double when this is only 76 megs? Someone answer that question? Because I don't see another M in this column. Oh, you know what it is? It's because some of these are directories. Yeah, okay. So that's even, that even proves my point even more, right? So now we're looking at, what was the database, the dump? I lost it. 644K versus 155 megs. That's almost comical right there. So here's the nice thing about the snapshot. And granted, it's not that difficult to use export DB and import DB. The nice thing about the snapshot is you can give them a name and a description if you want. I didn't give this one a description. But then there's also and I always forget it's either snapshot restore or no, yeah, it's restore snapshot. I think it should be snapshot restore, so they're next to one another, but you can do a DDEV restore snapshot, and then just give it a name. I think directly, yeah, and then boom, it actually will stop the containers because it has to remount the database.
So how hard is that if you really find it easier to type DDEV snapshot restore just because it's easier to remember? How hard is that to make a custom command that just runs the other command?
I don't know what the level of effort is to override an existing DDEV command.
Right. I know that with Drush, like you DDEV exec Drush, and then there's a really good example of a script that literally is just a shell script that wraps Drush and passes all your arguments to it, and it's just that short.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
With the internals, yeah.
At this point, I've just, I just don't use snapshot. Import and export DB are not that much more typing. There might be a use case where snapshots are better than the database dump. If there is, I haven't found it. I learned my lesson the hard way. Because I didn't do the little exercise we just did looking at sizes. And I've got a client with it's 2 GB database compressed in GZ. And I would use snapshots for them all the time. And they were like, I didn't even know what they were, 17, 18 gig snapshots, which very quickly just, my machine was like, no, not having it. So how do you structure your git ignore if DDEV is committed to the repo? I actually think it's already done for you. ls-al.ddev.gitignore. Oh, no, I don't want to. Let me just cat that. I think they're ignored by default. Ooh, what happened there? Wrong. Yeah, snapshots is already commented out by, is already ignored it for you. So DDEV, comes with a really handy git ignore that basically ignores all the stuff that is generated anyway. So you don't have to worry about that. So let me just do this while I'm here. rm-rf.ddev db snapshots. Kill that. Okay. Clear. All right. Yeah. So let's look at Gitpod, shall we? All right. So what is Gitpod? So Gitpod is this cool little service that basically you point it at a repository, and I know it supports Bitbucket, GitLab, and GitHub. You can point it at a repo, and you can also, let me close this. You also need to, like, where are the docs? You also basically need to give it like a .gitpod configuration file. that talks about like what the what Docker containers it needs. And then the cool thing is that then you basically, you type in a special URL, it's gitpod.io hashtag followed by the URL of your repository, and it spins up a remote development environment based on that repository. So that sounds like magic, and it is a bit of magic. So let me kind of take you through it. So this all started, and I want to make sure I give Shaw, yeah, Ofer Shaw is his name. I'll make sure I want to give him credit because he did the hard work. I did not do the hard work here. He figured out, Ofer figured out how to get DDEV up and running in Gitpod. So he basically created this repo that has, a Drupal site in it, but it also has a Gitpod configuration file and a Docker file. And then there's a couple minor changes you have to make to your DDEV config in order to get it all working. But he figured all this stuff out. So what I did was I came up with, based on the work he did, I turned it into a composer plugin to add gitpod.io support for DDEV local Drupal sites. Meaning if you have a site that's already running on DDEV local, if you add this composer plugin, and if you have a Gitpod account, that should be all you need to get your project up and running in Gitpod. So we're still, call it alpha for now. I haven't yet posted, published this on Packagist. Once I feel more people have used it, and I have talked to Ofer about a few other things as well. But at some point, I'll probably publish this on Packagist. But until then, there's a few steps. So, and I've actually already done those steps for DDEV demo. You can see there's the Gitpod stuff in there, but I'm going to take you through it, and then we'll actually get it up and running in Gitpod. So let's kind of just go through these steps. So number one, start with the Drupal 9 site. Ideally based on the recommended project composer template, with a DDEV local configuration file committed to a github.com repository, and theoretically it can be GitLab or Bitbucket. It should work. I've only tested it with GitHub. So as long as you have a Drupal 9 site that's up and running in DDEV on your local that is using recommended project, you should be okay. Will it work with things that aren't Drupal recommended project? Probably. There might be probably with Drupal 8. Again, we're early days, so please test it. And if it doesn't, let me know. Okay, so because it's not on Packagist yet, you can't just do a composer require ultimate, right? You can't just do this right off the bat. What you have to do, so step one is go into your composer.json and basically add the repository for the the dependency. Once this is posted on Packagist, you won't have to add this, but this is basically just adding a new repository to your composer project. It's a version control system, VCS, and this just points at my my plugin. All right, so that's step one. Step two, and this is a very Drupal-y thing. So this is why this only will work with Drupal sites. I take advantage of the core scaffolding plugin in order to write out some files. So in order for the core scaffolding plugin, well, I should say the other way around, in order for my dependency to work with the core scaffolding plugin, it basically needs, I need to give it permission, or I need to give the core scaffolding plugin permission that it can use files from this library as scaffolding files. And the way that's done is in the extra section. Think of this as the preferences section for the core composer scaffold dependency. So it's the Drupal scaffold key, but that's the key for core composer scaffold. I wish it was the same, but I wish it was more consistent, but it's not. And basically you have to just add this allowed packages section if you don't already have one. I have the Pantheon stuff in there as well, but you basically need to give my dependency permission to write scaffolding files. So you do that with this little line right there. So that is step 3. Then once you do that, then you can do a composer require. And because I haven't tagged anything yet, core scaffolding, I'll talk about, I'll circle back to that in a second. You just do a composer require. Again, note that nothing's tagged. So you're just going to basically say, give me the tip of the main branch. I'm using main instead of master there for this one. Then once you make all those changes, push them all to GitHub. All right, and then we'll carry on in a second. Let me answer this question. So core scaffolding concept. So without going too deep into it, let's see, how can I do this? Well, here, let's say this. The Drupal core project, recommended project composer template includes this dependency, Drupal core recommended, right? This is Drupal core. But the way composer works is it's going to take this dependency and it's going to put it by default in the vendor directory. But since we have composer installers, it knows to put, something that's of type Drupal core in the web core directory. So, by this being required, we end up with a core directory. Right? We end up in the web directory. Right? We end up with this directory and everything inside it. But if you build Drupal sites, you know that, well, index.php, that doesn't live in core. Robots.txt, that doesn't live in the core directory. There's all these other files, update.php, that are part of Drupal core, but they don't live in the core directory. So we need some way of getting these files in place. So that's the problem that the core composer scaffold does. It's a composer plugin, which basically is like a Drupal module that extends what composer does. So it's a composer plugin that basically it's configured to copy files from inside of the core directory to outside the core directory. So if you ever poke around that core directory, there's a scaffold, there's a web core assets scaffold directory, and inside there, oops, I always forget the files. Inside there, look at that. There's an index, there's our htaccess file, there's our update. So these are all the scaffolding files that come with Drupal core, but right now they're in the wrong place. So the core scaffolding plugin basically runs and moves index.php to its proper location. Moves it actually renames htaccess to .htaccess and puts it in the right place. And you'll see it like when you do let's see if I can scroll up to one. Probably the first time I did it. Well, if I do composer install, you'll see it. Don't worry, we'll finish Gitpod, I promise. So here's the scaffolding plugin running, but the files are already there, so you don't see anything. But the scaffolding plugin basically runs after a composer install and puts all the scaffolding files in place. So any module or any library can utilize the scaffolding plugin. And I basically just, my DDEV Drupal Gitpod library takes advantage of the scaffolding plugin to move some files from inside of my library to the web root, basically. So hopefully I answered your question, Matt. All right, so moving on. Okay, so now we basically, at this point, you should have up on GitHub or somewhere your repository. And as long as you follow the other steps, you're going to have, these files, Gitpod Docker file, Gitpod YAML, and there's actually a couple of them in DDEV as well. DDEV Drupal Gitpod, and then these two generate scripts as well. So as long as you have all that in place, the next step, oh, I'm in the wrong place. There we go. You have to make sure that your Gitpod settings allow this feature preview thing selected. I don't know if that's still the case, but let's just check to see. I haven't looked in about a week. Yeah, so you need this checked. This is kind of like the like with Gmail, there's like the Google Labs features you can enable. This is kind of like that. This allows you to run Docker containers inside of Gitpod's Docker containers. So without this, you're dead in the water. So you have to make sure you enable this and save that. All right, so that's this step. Then it's the magic step, right? Then you take your repos, close that out. You take your repos URL. You don't need the HTTP stuff. So I'm gonna copy that part. Doesn't really work well in Safari yet. Safari supports, ongoing, but so I'm in Chrome over here. And you do a pound, and then you just paste the URL to your repo. And as long as you're logged in and you've got that feature demo, Gitpod is basically going to, clone the repository. And by default, it does it just a read-only clone. So there's a little bit more work you have to do if you want to push back to your repo, but it's a public repo, so it can clone it. And when it clones it, it's going to see the .gitpod YAML file and the other files in there, and it's going to know what it needs to do to set up and what it needs to run in order for all this to work. And so basically what's happening here, this is going to take 4 or 5 minutes, something like that, but it's spinning up a Gitpod container. And once that container spun up, and we'll actually see part of this happening, it will install DDEV. And once it installs DDEV, it will run DDEV start. And those 3 containers will be up and running inside of a Gitpod container. And then they have the hosted VS Code as well. So, we'll see a view of our code, that's VS Code with a terminal. And I have not been able to think of anything that, I would need that it doesn't have for just, 95% of the development I do. Because the command line's all there, and it's the same thing as having, here we go. So here's VS Code. And we'll see down here, it's installing DDEV. Well, actually, it already installed DDEV. Now it's doing a DDEV start. So it's basically pulling down all of my containers now. But I mean, here's my repo. Here's our DDEV config and all that stuff, and web, boom here. And you can actually, it's got like Git integration. You have to do a little bit of work in order to give it permission to push back, but you could do Git commits right from here and push back to your repo. And this is, it's really a great tool. I actually have students using this tool already. I had a couple of students. Do you just configure keys for the GitHub push stuff or the Git push stuff?
Exactly.
I believe so. I actually haven't had time to do it yet.
That is so key to what I want to do with this stuff, because I have a lot of potentially a lot of interns that might not have really fast computers.
You can absolutely do it. I know that. I just haven't done it. And the use case I have a student who, actually I have 2 students who aren't super interested in any of the composer stuff. They're more of site builders. And they barely have ever used a command line. So that's a big ask. The class that I teach, most people want to learn composer and Git and all that stuff, but I have 2 students this semester that have no interest in that. So I basically have set up GitHub repositories for them for various lessons that they can basically just have that Gitpod account and do Gitpod pound, my GitHub repo and have this. So I should say, here, let me just go back. So there's a free tier, obviously, and there's a paid tier to Gitpod. So it's not all free. Hello, come on. Suddenly it's not loading for some reason, but anyway, there was a little message here before that said port 8080 was ready. That basically told me that, it was ready to go. So you can come down here. Actually, it's this long, gitpod.io URL. So we can do a command. Come on, click. Open. There we go. So this should open. I haven't imported the database on Gitpod yet, but we can do that just as easily. So this will show us the install screen here in a second. There we go. Okay, so if I go home, I'm gonna go to pricing. I always make it. I can never figure out how to get to like the pricing from here. Gitpod pricing, maybe. There we go. So the free tier, you get 50 hours a month, and that basically 50 hours of this running, right? So 50 hours a month. And I believe it times out after less than 30 minutes, or maybe right at 30 minutes. It times out pretty quick. So if you forget to close that tab, you're not screwed. You're not going to use up your 50 hours, but so 50 hours isn't bad. And, you know, for $9 a month, 100 hours, you know, $25 a month to like not have a real laptop, unlimited hours. I mean, that's fantastic. Yeah, no, Matt, I do that all the time. Yeah. Yeah. So, oh, you know what it is? Here, actually, GP. So there's actually command GP for Gitpod URL. I actually want the 8080 port. So if you do this command, it's probably one of these down here in this list. Actually, it's not even listed, but if you do the Gitpod 8080, yeah, that's the one we want. That's probably just, there we go. So here's the install screen, but we're in DDEV land. So hey, look at this, DDEV import DB, src equals DB. Remember, this is that same, oh, there's no autocomplete though, backup / DDEV demo db.sql.gz. And while we're at it, we'll do the files one as well. A little bit slower than on my local, but
It's still miraculous. It's amazing.
It is miraculous that, and you know, just the fact that this is like a nice, you know, editor environment in my browser. That's, I find that, I mean, full credit goes to Microsoft for that. That is just amazing.
It's all JavaScript.
Yeah. So yeah, so if I were to make a change here and
Mike,
then down here, this is like source control. It shows me the changes. So you know, there's some like the vendor stuff I haven't ignored. So those are changes, but it shows my change. And then there's like, I haven't played with this, but I can commit, or, you know, I can commit, or, you know, stuff there.
Mike.
Right, so yeah.
I think it was Randy of DDEV. Atlassian now has some tool or whatever that allows you to do PHP Storm now in the browser.
It's got a cool name too. What was it?
Project? I think it was just.
It had like a cool.
Yeah.
Storm Pod.
What was it? Storm Pod?
I made that up, but it sounded.
Oh, no, I just saw it files back. I can't type at the same time. What was it? DDEV demo files.zip, I think. Let's see if that works. Successfully imported. Okay, good. Come here, hit reload.
And by the way, that's the without the equal sign in there, you would still get the command line, the auto completion, which is why we were saying that earlier. But I also agree with you that for teaching people, the equal sign is very helpful.
But there we go. Now I've got the site up and running in Gitpod. And then from the Gitpod interface, I should show this. So this is like for my class, one of them that I have going, but so I can stop it whenever I want, and that will basically stop the clock on my 50 hours. But I don't have to go through the whole process next time if I don't want. I can just restart the existing pod, or whatever it's called, the existing workspace. So it's a lot faster the next time you want to start it up. So this is kind of like the first time you set it up. And as long as I don't need to change any of the Gitpod settings, we're good to go, because, you know, once you're in the workspace, you can do a git pull, wherever that is. So I basically showed you starting from nothing. So I would love feedback on, I know we're a little bit over, so I apologize. I would love feedback on this. And I'll put this, anybody put that in I'll put it in the Zoom chat just in case. So one thing I have to do, and I just haven't had a chance to get with Ofer. So basically I took, you know, Ofer knows I've been doing this. I basically copied, his files. I made a couple small modifications and moved them into my thing. And that's obviously not a sustainable solution, because if he continues to work on this, I'm just gonna have to keep on copying them over. So I got to talk to him about how we can best work together. And maybe we'll just decide that we want to put this dependency somewhere else rather than under my name. Doesn't matter. But anyway, that's where it is for now. So if you want to try it, if you see any issues, feel free to open up an issue in GitHub. And yeah, there you go.
I'm absolutely going to try this.
All right, perfect. Thank you.